Hello, everybody. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and this is a live stream with three of my esteemed and very smart colleagues. They're all political columnists for Bloomberg Opinion: Nia-Malika Henderson, Frank Wilkinson, and Patricia Lopez. And we're going to kick around some of the dynamics, electoral dynamics that surfaced last night, and just try to chew on what that means for the electoral road ahead in this very pivotal election year, and what to make of some of the issues, personalities, and forces that have come into play. Patricia, you wrote a great column today, sort of a sweeping column that went beyond Trump and really looked at the Iowa caucuses themselves. You noted that they were once as useful as checkbooks, 8-track cassettes were, but times have changed, and maybe it's time to move on. So, explain that a little bit to our viewers and listeners. What did you mean by that?
Well, like 8-tracks and checkbooks, it was a very useful process and really novel at the time that it was introduced. You were supposed to give ordinary Iowans a chance to, sit down in somebody's living room and meet with a presidential candidate. That's pretty heady stuff. They could ask them whatever they want. There weren't really a lot of handlers or interference back in the early 70s when this started, but it's just kind of devolved since then. I did talk to one gentleman who said that he met 3 people who eventually went on to become president in just that way, in living rooms and church basements. And I think he was kind of nostalgic for what was. And I met some people who still would like to see it go back to that, but that's clearly not where it is right now.
And the downside is simply that it's not statistically significant in terms of the number of voters, that Iowa benefits from timing rather than a real window onto the electoral mind, or what?
There were 100,000, maybe 110,000 voters who showed up last night among, more than 1,000 precincts. Yeah. And that's out of the entire state. That is just a fraction of the population. And as another political expert I talked to pointed out, a lot of those are people with political connections or from certain interest groups, or they're dyed-in-the-wool ideologues, some with fairly extreme views, which is why the Iowa caucus the Republican Iowa caucus has not produced a winner since 2000 with George W. Bush.
Yeah, I think barely just a smidge over 14% of registered Republicans turned out for this one. But you've created a nice segue to saying that Iowa hasn't produced a winner in some time, and that the person who came thunderously out of the gates in Iowa last night, the networks called it about 3 seconds after the votes began to get tallied, which I thought was rather amazing, was obviously Donald Trump. And I've sort of buried the lead a bit, Nia, in getting to him. But I don't think there's a surprise that Trump won, but there's some surprises in how he won and the magnitude with which he won, right?
Right. I mean, across all voter groups there, by age, by political leaning, as well, by education, by sort of class and income. And so that was the surprise, I think, how overwhelming and resounding the victory was. The thing about Iowa is that Iowa had always been the state that crowned the sort of evangelical winner of the party. And that person went on to win several states, usually southern states. We saw that with Ted Cruz last go round. This is affirmation that in Donald Trump, the Republicans have their evangelical candidate, right? And in some ways that was true in 2016 as well, right? There was always a thought that it was Mike Pence that really brought evangelicals around. Really, it was in so many ways Donald Trump's rhetoric, particularly around immigration, right? If you look at the broad swath of Republicans, the group that tends to be the most anti immigrant is evangelicals, white evangelicals. So, in some ways, when Donald Trump goes into these Iowa caucuses weeks ago and talks about the danger of immigrants from Asia and Africa poisoning the blood of the country, he knew his audience. He knew what those folks in Iowa wanted to hear, and they delivered in a big way for him, sending him on now to New Hampshire, into South Carolina. And we'll see. I mean, he looks to have a real head of steam behind him in really a really firm grasp on this Republican Party in a way that we always knew, but I think in a way that really is just underscored by the widespread victory that he amassed. Every county, I think, except one, and I think
98. He would have gotten 99, but he lost Johnson County by one vote.
One vote, exactly, to Nikki Haley. So it really is up to, I think, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis to figure out if they can kind of piece together a victory among the sort of anti-Trump Republicans, which are probably about a third of the party at this point.
Maybe one of them should pull a Trump and question whether or not people should have been looking more closely inside all those bags that were being carried around in the various precincts to collect votes.
Maybe there was complaining about the media calling it. So we've already had some skepticism raised about the validity of the vote.
Frank, Nia just raised the ever important issue of immigration and where this is playing. Trump has never really thought in a creative or sophisticated or even humane way about immigration beyond the idea of simply building a barrier. And are we at a point where voters, particularly voters in the Republican Party, are just fine with that?
I think you have to conclude yes. That was true during his administration. It's been true during the lead up to this campaign. And as Nia pointed out, I mean, his rhetoric could not be any more pointed about immigration. I mean, when you're garnering comparisons to Adolf Hitler more than once, it's clearly a deliberate effort. So he knows what the Republican base wants. He's always been quite in touch with the base, to the detriment of others in the party. And he clearly knows what they want to hear, and they're confirming that indeed they do want to hear that. I mean, we had polls saying nationwide Republicans are in favor of that, but also the Iowa caucus poll was that those voters were also quite fine with the notion of poisoning the bloodstream rhetoric.
Immigration was their top issue in landlocked Iowa that is far from either our northern or southern borders. And, as for his issue, he needs a group to demonize, and Hitler had Jews and Trump has immigrants, and he uses it to elevate, other supporters and say, you're better than them. They're coming for your jobs. They're bringing crime. They're bringing all the rest of these things at everything because they become the scapegoat for everything.
Some of them are good people.
Right.
And go
listen,
ahead, Nia.
We don't need to look to Hitler for examples of this demonization of other Americans. I mean, this has been part of the rhetoric of American politicians, and particularly Republican politicians over the last 50 or 60 years. You can think about the Willie Horton ad. You can think about the Jesse Helms affirmative action ad as well. George Bush was different on this, right? He was a compassionate conservative, and you had certain Republicans like Bob Dole to say, kick the racists out of the party. But this has always been a constant strain in American politics in general, and specifically among Republicans over the last many years. And so this is what has been quite successful for Donald Trump, this pitting of one group against each other, against this backdrop of a changing America, right? If you think about 2050, white people could be the minority. By that date, you'll have African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos who would make up the majority. And so there is real anxiety and fear and grievance around that. And so Donald Trump is very much stoking that to great effect. And we saw what happened in 2016, and it can certainly happen again in 2024. It could elect him to the White House again.
I think the thing to think about in that context is, while this has been percolating as an issue for a long time, and the GOP has been weaponizing racism and bigotry for some time, it has really reached a kind of synchronicity in Trump, because I think it also goes beyond the policy itself into this sort of cult of hero worship that is quasi-religious, is certainly political, is also about cultural and racial identity, that he is able, I think, to wield with a very unusual and craven narcissism that most candidates aren't willing to engage with. And he's done it to great effect. And I think in that context, it's obviously changing the party. Even though he's inherited these dynamics, he's feasted on them to such an extent that the party now, at least a successful path in the primaries to a party nomination, is to be like Trump, which others in the field tried to do and failed.
Right. It's curious to me that Hispanics in Texas are turning toward Trump. He's making some serious inroads with them. And I think that just is one more instance of the whole cult of personality. They're impervious to facts.
To me, one of the, there are a couple of ways to look at Iowa, right? One is that Trump was in effect an incumbent running for renomination. And so, gosh, he should have gotten better than half the vote. The other way to look at it is, he clobbered everybody. I'm way more in that second camp, but with a kind of, with a side trip, which is, everybody knew who this guy was. Everybody knows what he means for the Republican Party, which is that the Republican Party is a Trumpist party. It is Trump. If he becomes the nominee again, that's just out of the question that there's any kind of alternative movement at that point in the Republican Party. With those stakes, there were 54,000 Republicans who came out of the entire state of Iowa to vote against Trump. That to me just says there are not enough people who care deeply enough about the issues of democracy, the issues of pluralism, and all of the other things that Trump is really a battering ram against. There are not enough people in that party right now, certainly not in Iowa, to challenge that mainstream.
There may not be enough, even as many as you think, because a number of those people who turned out, Jan Seltzer, the head of the Iowa poll, told us that a lot of Haley's supporters were independents and Democrats who were going to caucus on that evening because they don't have a caucus of their own to go to. So some of her support may in fact be illusory. Even if she has support in New Hampshire, if those are independents and Democrats that are voting for her there, once you get to the contest between her and Joe Biden, are they going to go for a real Democrat? I think that's a fair question.
Well,
they'll just switch
so
back.
Nia, go ahead, Frank. Sorry, what did you say?
Just saying that long before you get there, you have the closed primaries where independents are not going to be permitted to vote and move the electorate that way.
Yeah, true.
So Nia, where does this leave Ron DeSantis? Let's take a look at him first. With he was in second place, but second place in Iowa meant being behind by 30 points. And his victory speech was, "I just got my ticket punched in Iowa," which I wondered where that ticket was going to. What plane was he getting on?
Yeah. Well, it's a plane to South Carolina. He's only about 5% in New Hampshire, so he's skipping that state. South Carolina doesn't happen for about a month. It's near the end of of February. So that is where he's going to make his last stand. In so many ways, I think it's a great state for Ron DeSantis. It's probably a better state for Ron DeSantis than Nikki Haley, but I think it's the best state of all for Donald Trump in terms of just the makeup of the Republican Party there. You've got some, Chamber of Commerce types of Republican, sort of the khakis and loafers and golf shirts wing of the party. And then, of course, you've got evangelicals. And as we've seen in Iowa, Donald Trump does quite well there. And some of this is about Donald Trump's presentation, this sort of toxic masculinity, sort of unreconstructed masculinity. And those sort of traditional notions are very, very popular with folks in South Carolina. Nikki Haley, of course, was the governor of South Carolina, was out of office in 2017, but she is trying to do something very difficult, and that is win a primary as a woman and as a brown person. And this is something that has simply never been done in Republican presidential nominating contests. And again, it's against the backdrop of this rhetoric we've been talking about change, about poisoning the blood of the country. And it's just a very, very hard row to hoe for her. DeSantis obviously was trying to kind of mimic some of that, right? To be Donald Trump, but the Donald Trump that can actually get things done, leaning in very heavily into these culture wars. I think he kind of thought that would mean he would be able to carve out an evangelical lane. We saw in Iowa, he wasn't really able to do that. And I think just some of his issues around seeming to be human are catching up with him. He's very robotic. South Carolina is one of those places. I'm from South Carolina. South Carolina is one of those places that I think it very much favors warmth. It favors relatability. It all those things that I think Ron DeSantis is going to have a lot of trouble with in South Carolina, but he's making his last stand there, essentially ignoring New Hampshire. And so we'll see. But again, I think it's a perfect state for Donald Trump. And the last poll I saw had him up, I think, by 30 points in South Carolina. Again, this is a state where Nikki Haley, many South Carolinas ago, different iterations of the Republican Party, she was the governor of that state. But again, I think it's Donald Trump's to lose.
Nia, do you think we're going to see more of this ordained by God message that Trump has been pushing? Because that seems ideal for South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, listen, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian church. My mom was Pentecostal and my dad was a Baptist minister, which made for a very interesting childhood.
I want to hear about that later.
Yeah. That'll be a whole live stream in and of itself.
Right. So, yeah, I think this rhetoric around God is perfect for him. I remember in 2016, I was asking Ben Carson, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, very religious man. How could you support somebody like Donald Trump, who didn't even know, who basically called 2 Corinthians 2 Corinthians, who said he'd never asked for forgiveness, which is sort of a tenet of Christianity.
He doesn't go to church. He's never been religious his entire life.
That's right. And so he said that, it takes all kinds to advance God's kingdom, right? And so I think this is sort of the approach that many folks, Bible believers who go to church, a couple of times a week, that's how they see Donald Trump. He might not be a perfect vessel, but he is somebody who is advancing God's kingdom. And so Donald Trump, he of 2 Corinthians is very much leaning into that, and it's a smart political strategy.
But I think in addition to the fact that some Christians see him as a useful cudgel, right? He got Roe v. Wade overturned, et cetera. Evangelical Christianity has changed itself, and it's as much now about political and cultural identity as it is about church going and spirituality. Right. And on that identity front, Trump comports perfectly with the kind of culture war a lot of evangelicals see themselves in.
Right. I think that's, and Frank, you just wrote about this.
Well, raising the stakes of that culture war works for Trump because it increases the fear. in people who feel that the culture is getting away from them, right? That we're no longer going to be a Christian nation, we're no longer going to be a white nation. So constantly hammering at that fear and ratcheting up that fear has been his most successful tactic. So I can't imagine it's going to stop. And it has won him a vast, vast number of votes among evangelical whites.
Patricia, what do you think? Pardon me. Do you think that Nikki Haley is done in South Carolina? I mean, it's her home state. She was the governor of South Carolina. If Trump, beats her as soundly there as he did in Iowa, that's the end of the road for her, isn't it?
It could be, and that's why I'm going to be really curious to see what her support looks like once she comes out of New Hampshire. She was the governor of South Carolina in a different era. It was pre-Trump, for one thing, and is she still a good fit for that state? Could she even get elected governor again? I think that's a really open question. And now you have Trump, who appointed her as ambassador, who's now beating on her as some kind of globalist rhino. Who's not tough enough to take on world leaders. That's going to hurt with that crowd.
Nia, one of the things, sorry to Frank, go ahead.
I just had one comment, which is she had to be an extremely capable politician to win that office in South Carolina. Whatever you think about her now, whatever you think about the way she has run this campaign, to become governor of South Carolina as an Indian American woman, first generation immigrant, was a hell of an accomplishment.
Yeah. And listen, you see some of that skill now in debates, for example. She is a very, very talented politician. I mean, she was heralded as the face of the New South when she was governor. I think it was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. Trump obviously wanted to appoint her ambassador, UN. I think he said that she looks the part. I think that was one of the reasons that he did it. But that, again, that sort of identity issue, I think he's going to try to use that against her, both subtly and overtly. I think his nickname for her is something like Bird Brain or something like
Bird
that.
Brain.
So yeah. Tim, you had a question?
Well, it's a little bit. It's actually off that Donald Trump, whose own IQ isn't in the stratosphere, wasted little time going into this caucus belittling his opponents, including Nikki Haley, calling her bird brain. Yet last night, during his victory speech, he gave what for Trump was a somewhat statesman-like speech when he landed on discussions of his opponents. He congratulated DeSantis and Haley. He had been savaging Ramaswamy, I think, right up until the day before the caucus. And he's had something nice to say about Ramaswamy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't expect any of them should get comfortable with the idea that the suddenly warm and fuzzy side of Donald Trump is a permanent state of affairs. But it did reflect that in this cycle is at least organizationally a little bit different than the candidate in 2016. He had precinct captains all over Iowa. They have been working hand in glove with the Heritage Foundation to develop a plan of attack for essentially defenestrating the federal government when he assumes office. And he's trying, even if he's not very good at it, to be magnanimous in moments of victory. And I wonder, does this speak to you at all about how he's going to campaign against Biden?
Don't you think that was kind of a power move? That's how it struck me, that I am so far ahead of you, like 30 points ahead of you, that I can afford to pat you on the head and say, "Oh, you did a good job there, little guy." That's kind of how it came across to me when he talked about DeSantis, Haley, and Ramaswamy.
Except that's not in the past how he's rolled, even when he's had
it's not
a victory. I mean, think about his inaugural address.
Yeah,
which was a vision of darkness.
Operations where he is not condemning his opponents, And I would say there's one other element of that, and whether it's conscious or not, it's another confirmation that words have no meaning, right? One day Ramaswamy's a jerk, and the next day he's fine. It's just, there is only what he needs to say at the second that he needs to say it. There is no lasting power of words. There's no lasting value of words, and there's no lasting truth. There's only moment by moment need. So it's just a further confirmation of A, who he is, and B, how I'm pretty confident we will see him run against Biden, which is in his typical fashion, which is say whatever he needs to say to get through this 10-second moment. And then after that, it's forgotten.
I think that's right. And it could be in that moment, his advisors were saying, listen, be presidential, right? You are likely going to be the GOP nominee. Remind the country that you were president, that you can be presidential, particularly those independent voters, those suburban mom voters who in some ways may have memory hold some of the battle days from the Trump administration. So I think he can do that. It is to his benefit to appear normal. I thought part of this was also, I mean, this was a little while ago, but when Melania Trump went to the funeral of Rosalind Carter, right? As the first lady who died, she was sitting there with the other first ladies. I thought that was also part of this argument that Trump is going to make of just normalcy, that I belong to the club too. My wife is sitting there next to, I think she was sitting next to Michelle Obama, who didn't look so pleased all the time, but understandably. So I think this is part of what he's doing. Listen, the media helps him do that, kind of give the veneer of normalcy, that this is just another run-of-the-mill Republican who is running, not someone who is authoritarian, not somebody who was behind January 6th, not somebody who was disastrous on COVID, not somebody who's a racist, who's a bigot, and all sorts of other things, but that he is just like anybody else, and not that different, quite frankly, from Joe Biden.
Right. Watch me wave my hand while I torch the Constitution.
Right.
Where are the Democrats and Biden right now, Patricia? Where do you see them positioning themselves with this momentum on full display?
Yeah, I wish he were better at messaging his accomplishments, and that Democrats were better.
You're talking about Biden? You're talking about Biden?
Talking about Biden. It's disturbing to me how much of an obstacle his age seems to be to otherwise solid Democrats. And they seem to be oblivious to the fact that Trump is only a few years younger and ostensibly in much worse shape.
Well, but he doesn't present as
he doesn't present that way. He presents very
Biden. He's a clearer and more vibrant speaker right now than Biden is.
Yes.
I think the age thing is a canard myself to a certain extent, but I don't think you can deny that Biden on the vitality scale sometimes more frequently than not doesn't compare well to Trump.
I think the other thing that is difficult for a lot of Democratic voters is many of them are taking care of their aging parents, who are in that age bracket, 80, 81. They can look out to 86. We have lots and lots of them in Minnesota. It's the fastest growing demographic group is super aged seniors. And I think they look at where their parents are, and then they look at Biden and they wonder how can he last much longer?
I also think the age issue, which has traction, obviously, also distracts from the rational issue, which is regardless of where one's politics reside, Biden has surrounded himself with responsible adults who have executed in a rational and reasonable way around foreign policy, domestic issues, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a likelihood that Donald Trump will surround himself with fanatics. It's not too far of a stretch to wonder whether or not Michael Flynn would be defense secretary in a Trump administration. And how do you read that, Frank? How do you read that playing with voters as the months roll on towards November?
Well, look, the bottom line is we're going to have an overwhelmingly negative campaign run from both sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Trump will, on the one hand, be saying that he had the greatest economy in the history of the world and making up whatever he needs to make up, but he's mostly going to be running a lot of attacks on Biden, and a lot of them will be sort of subterranean videos, even using AI perhaps, about how this guy's out of touch. He's an old geezer who can't handle anything. He's a puppet being pulled on strings. And the Biden campaign unquestionably is going to run 90% of their campaign on this guy is an absolute danger to democracy, to the economy, and to the world. And his own senior cabinet officials and senior White House aides all say so. So I think it's a pretty clear, battle line that's coming down the road. It's going to be very ugly. It's going to be a very negative campaign. And I frankly don't think there's going to be a lot of positive campaigning. I think the Biden people are resigned to the fact that the economy is however people perceive the economy to be. So that they can keep claiming that the economy is doing terrifically and unemployment is at record lows and wages are up compared to inflation, et cetera, et cetera. And all those things may be true, but it doesn't matter. So people are going to perceive what they perceive personally about the economy. And then the question is, do you want to take a risk again on someone who's in, most senior cabinet officials say is completely unfit for office and whose track record, reveals as much, and who, by the way, if things go, certainly as Jack Smith would like them to go, may be convicted of felonies before he even gets the nomination.
I think the threat to democracy message is a really good one for Biden, and he ought to embrace it even more than he has been. I do think a lot of Democrats want to see a warrior for democratic values. They want someone who is really going to advance these arguments that this is not this nation's future, is to be an autocratic, nation run by a quasi-dictator. They don't want that. And if he can bind them, if Biden can bind them to him emotionally on that level, then I think he'll do much better.
Yeah, and you saw him do that. The two speeches that he gave already, one in
Yes.
Valley Forge about democracy and being the defender of democracy,
Powerful.
and then Emmanuel Church, and this argument that, electing Donald Trump is also electing his lawless mob, right? The kinds of folks who stormed the Capitol and tried to actually did stop for a time the peaceful transfer of power. Is that the country who America wants to be? And that'll be the choice. It was he leaned into that theme, I think, going into 2022, the whole thing of what happened in Charlottesville, the battle for the soul of the nation. That was one of the reasons he wanted to run to begin with in 2022 in 2020. And so I think you're going to have Republicans echo some of that, right? If you think about Chris Christie's farewell speech, it was all about, is Donald Trump really fit to be in an office? His answer, of course, a resounding no. And it's partly because he will put his own interests before the interests of the country. So Democrats, I think, are right to assume that putting it in those big stakes and reminding voters of what they saw, right? What voters saw for 4 years. And of course, over these last couple of years with the big lie, is that the person you want to give such power at this point in time in American history?
And of course, that message is going to be targeted at a handful of voters in a handful of swing states, right? Because I think we've learned now from the Iowa, the entrance polls and the way that vote played out, that most Republican voters no longer seem to care at all. Trump may have committed crimes, or that he incited the January 6th insurrection, or that he's a sexual predator, and on and on and on. He's had any number of things that would normally derail any other politician permanently, has not only been forgiven by some people in his party, but embraced. And I think, the wild card here to me is it's not clear how those issues are going to play out with moderates and independents.
I think one way they could play out better for Democrats is if Chris Christie and Liz Cheney take up major roles in this election, and whether that means a third party run as a conservative constitutional party, whether that obviously they're not going to get on ballots, but if they are out there making a case that this is an emergency, that makes it a little easier for Biden and company. I'm not sure it would have much of an impact on Republicans, but there are clearly some set of Republicans who are not going to be comfortable voting for Donald Trump.
Yeah. You saw in 2020, Governor Kasich actually endorse President Biden. Is that something that somebody like Chris Christie, who I imagine thinks he has a future in the Republican Party, Liz Cheney, the same thing, is that something they're willing to do? I mean, the other thing is that you can sort of just cut an ad on what Chris Christie said. You almost don't even need a real endorsement because, his words were his words. He sounded like Joe Biden at times in that speech that he gave in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not going to help sway a lot of Republicans, though.
Well, but they're not necessarily the ones who have to be swayed for a path to the White House. Yeah. Folks, the clock has ticked away on us, and I think it's time to wrap this one up. Nia-Malika Henderson, Frank Wilkinson, and Patricia Lopez, I want to thank all three of you for joining us today, talking about the Iowa caucuses.
Thank you.